The flight attendant stood firm, blocking his path. "Sir, you need to move to economy. First class is for premium passengers only." The man looked up, calm, unreadable. She had no idea who she was talking to, and by the time she realized her mistake, it was already too late. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. The plane doors were open, and passengers slowly made their way to their seats. Among them, Ethan Vance settled into his first-class seat, placing his bag neatly under the chair in front of him. He adjusted his seatbelt, feeling the smooth leather against his back. It was a rare treat for him, something he never indulged in. His life had always been about giving to others, his students, his school, his community. But this time, he had allowed himself something special, a break he had postponed for far too long. He looked out the window, watching the busy runway, unaware that his moment of peace was about to be shattered. A shadow fell over him. "Sir, I need to check your ticket." Ethan turned to see a flight attendant, Ms. Chandler, standing beside him. She was tall, poised, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. But there was something else in her expression. Doubt. Ethan nodded, reaching into his pocket and handing her the slip of paper without hesitation. She barely glanced at it before raising an eyebrow. "This is for first class," she said, her voice carrying an edge of skepticism. "Yes," Ethan replied calmly. Ms. Chandler studied him for a moment. Then she pressed her lips together. "Are you sure this wasn't issued to you by mistake?" A few passengers turned their heads slightly, sensing the shift in tone. Some looked away, pretending not to listen, while others watched with quiet interest. Ethan exhaled slowly. "No mistake. I purchased it myself." Ms. Chandler let out a small, impatient sigh. "Right. I just need to confirm something in our system. Please step aside while I handle this." Ethan held her gaze for a moment before nodding. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, his presence quiet but firm. The other first-class passengers avoided eye contact, pretending not to notice what was happening. Ms. Chandler gestured for him to follow her toward the galley, where she picked up the in-flight phone and punched in a code. She spoke in a lower voice, but Ethan could still hear the irritation in her tone. After a moment, she turned back to him with an exaggerated smile, the kind that wasn't real. "There seems to be an issue with your booking," she said. "We can offer you a seat in economy while we sort this out." Ethan's jaw tensed, but he kept his voice level. "There is no issue. My ticket is valid." Her smile thinned. "Sir, I don't want to repeat myself. Please take your things and move to economy." The energy in the cabin shifted. Passengers in economy had started noticing, their heads lifting to see what was happening. A quiet murmur spread through the plane like a slow-moving wave. Ethan looked at Ms. Chandler for a long moment. He saw it in her face. She had already decided that he didn't belong here. No matter what he said, no matter what his ticket said, her mind was made up. Without another word, he turned, walked back to his seat, and reached for his carry-on. He pulled it from the overhead bin, slid the strap over his shoulder, and began walking down the aisle toward economy. He could feel the stares following him, some filled with curiosity, others with quiet judgment, but no one spoke up, no one said a word. Ethan lowered himself into an empty seat in economy, letting out a slow breath. The space was tighter, the seat rougher, but it wasn't the downgrade that bothered him. It was the humiliation. His fingers hovered over his phone before he finally typed a message. "Boarded. Got moved to economy. Flight attendant refused to check my ticket properly." He hit send. A few seconds later, his phone vibrated. "What do you mean they moved you?" Ethan's gaze flickered toward the front of the plane. Ms. Chandler continued her duties, unaware of the mistake she had just made. Another message appeared. "Give me the flight number." Ethan typed it in. There was a long pause. Then the final message came. "Sit tight. This isn't over." Ethan sat in the cramped economy seat, his fingers resting on the phone screen as he stared out the small window. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, but his mind was elsewhere. He had spent his life teaching respect, fairness, and patience, yet he had just been dismissed without question, without hesitation, as if he were invisible. The first-class passengers, the ones who had watched him be escorted away, went back to their conversations, their drinks, their comfort. No one had spoken up. No one had asked if he needed help. His phone buzzed again. Who was the attendant? Ethan sighed, rubbing his temple before typing back. Didn't catch her first name. Last name on her tag was Chandler. The reply came almost instantly. Noted. Ethan exhaled. He had no idea what was happening on the other end of that conversation, but he trusted it. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, Ms. Chandler poured herself a quick cup of coffee, ignoring the glances from the other flight attendants. One of them, a younger woman named Sienna, hesitated before speaking. Was there an issue with that man's ticket? Ms. Chandler rolled her eyes. He was sitting in first class. Sienna frowned. Yeah, but... You saw him, Ms. Chandler interrupted. She took a sip of coffee, her voice dripping with certainty. He didn't look like a first-class passenger, probably a mistake in the system. Or maybe someone gave him the ticket. Either way, I wasn't about to let him sit up there when he clearly didn't belong. Sienna's stomach twisted. She wanted to say something to push back, but she knew better. Ms. Chandler had been with the airline for years, and she had a reputation for being strict, the kind of person who never admitted she was wrong. Sienna looked toward first class, where the empty seat where Ethan had been sitting stood out. Something about this didn't feel right. Back in economy, Ethan's phone buzzed again. A new message. What gate are you landing at? Ethan raised an eyebrow before checking the boarding pass tucked in the seat pocket. He sent the gate number back. A pause. Then the last message came. Understood. Just stay put. Ethan leaned back in his seat, watching the flight attendants move about the cabin, serving drinks, adjusting trays, acting as if nothing had happened. But something told him this wasn't over. Not even close. Ms. Chandler moved through the first-class cabin, adjusting trays and offering drinks, completely unbothered by what had just happened. She had seen plenty of passengers try to slip into first class over the years, and as far as she was concerned, this was no different. The man had taken his seat without protest, which only confirmed what she already believed. He didn't belong there. But what she didn't realize was that her decision had set off a chain reaction she wasn't prepared for. Up in the cockpit, Captain Rowan Hughes received an urgent message on the in-flight communication line. The moment he read the name attached to the inquiry, his eyes narrowed. He turned to the co-pilot, his voice low and serious. "Pull up the passenger manifest," he said. The co-pilot frowned but complied, tapping a few buttons on the screen before the list appeared. The names scrolled quickly until they stopped on one in particular. Ethan Vance. Captain Hughes read the details twice, his pulse kicking up slightly. He knew that name. Everyone in the airline industry knew that name. His eyes flickered back to the message on his screen. The request was clear. Confirm immediately if Ethan Vance was removed from first class. The co-pilot glanced over, sensing the tension in the air. Is that the Ethan Vance? Captain Hughes didn't answer right away. His mind was already running through the consequences of what had just happened. He reached for the in-flight phone and dialed the lead flight attendant's line. A few seconds later, Ms. Chandler's voice came through, light and unconcerned. "This is Chandler." Captain Hughes's tone was steady, but there was a new weight behind his words. "Ms. Chandler, I need to confirm something. Did you remove a first-class passenger named Ethan Vance?" There was a brief pause on the other end. Then, her confident voice came back. "Yes, Captain. His ticket didn't match first-class status, so I had him moved to economy." Captain Hughes's grip on the phone tightened slightly. "Did you verify his ticket?" he asked. Ms. Chandler let out a small laugh, the kind someone gives when they think they're being questioned over nothing. "Captain, I've been working flights for over a decade. I can tell when someone doesn't belong in first class." A longer pause this time. Then Captain Hughes spoke again, but his voice had shifted, colder now, more precise. Ms. Chandler, do you know who Ethan Vance is? There was silence on the other end of the line. Captain Hughes didn't wait for her to answer. Ethan Vance is the owner of this airline. The phone line went dead silent. Ms. Chandler's face drained of color. For the first time since the flight began, she felt something she had never felt before. She had made a mistake, one that couldn't be undone. Ms. Chandler stood frozen, her grip tightening on the in-flight phone. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time in her career she felt a sharp sting of panic. The silence stretched between her and Captain Hughes, thick and suffocating. She tried to process what he had just said, but her mind refused to catch up. Ethan Vance, the owner of the airline? That couldn't be right. He didn't look like someone who owned an airline. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wasn't acting entitled. He had just sat there, quietly. Ms. Chandler swallowed, forcing herself to speak. There must be some mistake, she said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. No mistake, Captain Hughes replied, his tone firm and unwavering. Mr. Vance was a confirmed first-class passenger. You removed him without verifying his ticket, and now we have direct orders from the executive office. Miss Chandler felt the blood drain from her face. Orders? Captain Hughes continued, his words slicing through her panic. You are to personally escort Mr. Vance back to first class and issue a public apology. Upon landing, you will be required to report to the executive board for a formal review of this incident. Ms. Chandler's breath caught in her throat. A formal review? This wasn't just a minor complaint, this was something far bigger. She forced herself to keep her voice steady. Captain, I was just following protocol. There was a brief pause, and then Captain Hughes responded with a cold finality. No, Ms. Chandler, you weren't. The line went dead. Ms. Chandler slowly lowered the phone, her hands trembling slightly. Around her, the other flight attendants were starting to notice the change in her demeanor. Sienna, the younger attendant, hesitated before speaking. Everything okay? Ms. Chandler didn't answer. Her mind was spinning. She had always believed she had control over situations like this. She had handled hundreds of flights, made dozens of judgment calls, and never once had she been challenged like this. But now she was no longer in control. She was about to walk back into economy, not as the flight attendant in charge, but as someone who had just humiliated the most powerful man on the plane. And the worst part? She had no idea how he was going to respond. Ms. Chandler's legs felt heavy as she made her way down the narrow aisle. Every step she took toward economy made the realization sink in deeper. She had humiliated the owner of the airline in front of an entire cabin of passengers. She had dismissed him, spoken down to him, and removed him from a seat he had rightfully paid for. And now she had to face him. The economy section was quieter than before. Some passengers had already pieced together that something was going on. Their eyes flickered between Ms. Chandler and Ethan, who sat calmly in his seat, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. He hadn't caused a scene. He hadn't protested. And somehow, that made it worse. Ms. Chandler stopped beside his row and cleared her throat, forcing a tight professional smile. Mr. Vance, she began, her voice lower now, no longer carrying the same authority it had before. There has been a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to first class. Ethan slowly looked up at her, his calm gaze locking onto hers. A misunderstanding, he repeated, his tone neutral. Ms. Chandler's hands clasped together tightly, and for the first time in years she struggled to find her words. Yes, she said quickly. I regret the error. Please allow me to assist you back to your original seat. A few passengers nearby stopped pretending not to listen. They had seen everything before, but now they were seeing something new. A flight attendant who had been so certain of herself suddenly backtracking. Ethan didn't move. He simply tilted his head slightly and asked, Why? Ms. Chandler blinked, caught off guard. Excuse me? Ethan sat forward slightly, his tone still calm but firm. Why are you moving me back now? You seemed sure I didn't belong up there earlier." A few passengers exchanged glances, sensing the shift in power. Ms. Chandler's throat felt dry. There was an error in seating. Ethan studied her for a long moment, letting the silence stretch between them. Ms. Chandler shifted uncomfortably, her confidence cracking under the weight of his gaze. Then, without raising his voice, without any visible anger, Ethan Vance made her feel something she wasn't used to feeling: accountability. "I had my ticket," he said. "You saw it." Ms. Chandler nodded stiffly. "And yet you still asked me to move," Ethan continued. "You didn't check the system. You didn't ask anyone else in first class to show their ticket, just me." The air around them felt heavier now. Ms. Chandler opened her mouth to speak, but for the first time she had no defense. Ethan leaned back, watching her, his expression unreadable. "If you're going to apologize," he said, his voice steady, "at least tell the truth." A stifling silence fell over the cabin. Ms. Chandler felt every single pair of eyes on her. She had spent years enforcing rules, making judgment calls, handling difficult passengers without a second thought. But this time, she had been wrong, and everyone around her knew it. Ms. Chandler's face burned as Ethan's words settled in the air. The economy cabin was completely silent now. Passengers waiting, watching, their curiosity turning into expectation. She had spent years controlling situations like this, deciding who was in the right and who needed to be corrected. But now, she wasn't in control. He was. Her lips parted, but no words came out. What could she say? That she hadn't thought twice before removing him. That she had judged him not by his ticket but by how he looked. She had never been questioned like this before, not in front of a plane full of people. Ethan didn't gloat or smirk. He didn't even raise his voice. That was what made it worse. He was just waiting, patient, calm, like a teacher watching a student struggle to find the right answer. Ms. Chandler took a slow breath, feeling the weight of her mistake pressing down on her. She knew the only way out of this moment was to do something she had never had to do before. Admit she was wrong. She straightened her uniform, forcing herself to look at him directly. "You're right," she said, her voice quieter now, stripped of its usual authority. "I didn't check the system. I made an assumption and I treated you unfairly." A few passengers exchanged glances, some surprised she had actually said it, others looking unimpressed that it had taken this long. Ethan nodded once as if he already knew the truth but wanted to hear her say it out loud. Ms. Chandler shifted her stance, glancing around as the uncomfortable reality of the situation sank in. She wasn't just apologizing to him. She was apologizing in front of an entire flight of people. She cleared her throat, her voice more professional now. "I sincerely apologize, Mr. Vance. I should have verified your ticket instead of assuming there was a mistake." Ethan studied her for a moment longer, his expression unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he stood up. The moment he did, the tension in the cabin shifted. Ms. Chandler exhaled, relieved that he wasn't going to push it further. She quickly stepped aside, gesturing for him to follow her back to first class. But before walking past her, Ethan turned slightly and spoke again. Not to her, but to the passengers still watching the scene unfold. "Funny how I was told to move so quickly," he said, his voice steady, almost casual. "But when it was time to fix the mistake, that took a little longer." A ripple of uneasy murmurs spread through the economy section. Some passengers nodded subtly in agreement. Others just looked away, uncomfortable with the truth now sitting right in front of them. Ms. Chandler didn't respond. She just turned, leading him back to first class, feeling the stares from every row she passed. Her uniform had never felt so tight. Her usual confidence had never felt so fragile. And for the first time in her entire career, Ms. Chandler realized that this wasn't just about one passenger. This was about what happened when power was misused. Ms. Chandler walked stiffly ahead, each step heavier than the last. She could feel the weight of the passengers' gazes pressing against her back. No one was whispering anymore. They didn't need to. The silence carried more judgment than words ever could. Ethan followed at a steady pace, unrushed, unbothered, as if he had all the time in the world. The first-class passengers turned as he re-entered the cabin, their expressions a mixture of confusion and discomfort. Some quickly looked away, suddenly interested in their books or in-flight screens. Others, the ones who had witnessed the scene earlier, shifted in their seats, knowing full well what was happening. Ethan reached his original seat, adjusted his bag, and calmly sat down. Not once did he acknowledge Ms. Chandler standing beside him. Ms. Chandler swallowed hard, forcing herself to maintain her professionalism, despite the growing tightness in her chest. The moment stretched too long, and she knew she had to say something. "If there's anything you need, Mr. Vance, please let me know." Ethan slowly turned his head toward her, his expression unreadable. He let the words hang in the air before responding. "You didn't ask me that before." The sentence hit her like a slow, deliberate punch to the gut. Ms. Chandler blinked. She knew exactly what he meant. She had treated every other first-class passenger with a bright, polished smile. She had greeted them warmly, offered them drinks before takeoff, made sure they were comfortable. But not him. She had walked right up to his seat, questioned him and removed him without hesitation. She had spoken to him with doubt instead of courtesy, suspicion instead of respect. The power shift was complete now. For the first time in her career, Ms. Chandler was the one being watched, judged, and held accountable. "I apologize for that as well," she said, her voice quieter now, lacking the confidence it had before. Ethan didn't respond. He simply gave a slow nod, then picked up the in-flight magazine from the seat pocket and began flipping through the pages, as if she wasn't worth any more of his attention. That dismissal, not cruel, not aggressive, just indifferent, burned deeper than any argument could have. Miss Chandler's throat tightened. She turned quickly and walked back toward the galley, keeping her steps even, keeping her shoulders squared. She wouldn't let them see her break. But inside, her hands were shaking. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Hughes placed the in-flight phone back on the hook, his jaw tight. He had been in aviation long enough to know what was about to happen next. He turned to the co-pilot who had been listening closely the entire time. "We'll be receiving further instructions from ground control before we land," Captain Hughes said, his voice even. The co-pilot hesitated. "So, is she fired?" Captain Hughes let out a slow breath through his nose. "Not my call," he said. "But I'll tell you this. This won't just disappear." The cockpit fell into a thoughtful silence, the hum of the engines filling the space between them. Back in the first-class cabin, Ethan sat back, his fingers lightly tapping against the armrest. He wasn't angry. He wasn't gloating. He was simply waiting. Because he knew something Ms. Chandler didn't. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The real consequences? Those were waiting for her when the plane landed. The plane cruised smoothly through the sky, but inside the cabin the atmosphere was far from steady. Tension clung to the air like humidity before a storm, thick and undeniable. Ms. Chandler stood inside the galley, her back pressed against the counter, breathing slowly, deliberately. She had spent years mastering control, knowing exactly how to handle difficult passengers, difficult situations. But this was unlike anything she had ever faced. Her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the counter as she replayed the last few minutes in her head. She had been forced to walk back through economy, the same aisle she had sent Ethan down earlier, and every single passenger had seen it. The murmurs, the way they stared, the shift in energy. It was clear. They weren't just watching a flight attendant doing her job. They were watching her undo her mistake. And worse, they were watching her lose. A quiet voice broke through her thoughts. "You really sweating this, huh?" Ms. Chandler turned sharply. Sienna stood near the entrance of the galley, arms crossed, watching her carefully. "I don't need your input right now," Ms. Chandler snapped, but her voice lacked the bite it usually had. Sienna smirked, tilting her head slightly. I'm just saying, you don't look as confident as you did 20 minutes ago. Ms. Chandler's jaw tightened. She wasn't going to entertain this conversation. She had worked hard for her position, climbed through the ranks, made decisions based on efficiency, order, professionalism. She had been so sure that she had done the right thing. And yet, here she was, gripping the counter like a lifeline, feeling her world tilt. Sienna sighed, shaking her head. You know, if you had just treated him like any other first-class passenger, none of this would be happening. Ms. Chandler shot her a glare. I didn't do anything wrong. Sienna raised an eyebrow. Really? Because from where I'm standing, you didn't check his ticket, you embarrassed him in front of everyone, and now you had to bring him back like a kid sent to the principal's office. Ms. Chandler's pulse kicked up. That's not... Save it, Sienna cut in, her voice sharper now. Because we both know what's coming when we land. Ms. Chandler felt a cold chill creep down her spine. She hadn't let herself think about that yet. What exactly was waiting for her when the plane touched the ground? A passenger complaint? A meeting with a supervisor? A warning? Or worse, was this career ending? Ms. Chandler shoved the thought away. She wasn't about to let one passenger ruin everything she had worked for. But deep down, she wasn't sure if she even had a say in it anymore. Meanwhile, in first class, Ethan Vance sat comfortably in his seat, but he wasn't relaxed. His mind was working through the bigger picture, the wider implications of what had just happened. He had been in the airline industry for years. He had seen how things worked from the top down. And this wasn't about one flight attendant making a bad call. It was about how many people like Ms. Chandler had done the same thing to others, without consequences. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his messages. There was already a new one waiting for him. Assistant. Finalizing details. There will be an official response after landing. Ethan smirked slightly. He had a pretty good idea of what that meant. This wouldn't be a quiet slap on the wrist. No, Ms. Chandler wasn't just going to be spoken to. She was about to become an example. He set his phone down and looked around the first-class cabin. The same passengers who had watched him be escorted out earlier now avoided his gaze. Funny, people only cared when they realized they were sitting next to someone with power. But what about all the times it had happened to people without power? What about the ones who never got an apology, never got their seats back, never had the chance to watch the same person who humiliated them crumble under the weight of their mistake? Ethan's jaw tensed slightly. Maybe it was time to change that. He leaned back, stretching his legs out slightly. The plane was still in the air, but the fallout had already begun. The plane continued its steady course through the sky, but for some, time was moving at a much different pace. For Ms. Chandler, it was dragging, every second stretching into an eternity as she stood in the galley, gripping the edges of the counter. The once firm ground beneath her had turned to sand, and she could feel herself sinking with every passing minute. For Ethan Vance, it was the opposite. His world was moving quickly now, pieces falling into place, decisions being made behind the scenes. And for the rest of the passengers, there was an undeniable shift in energy. Even the ones who had been completely detached at the start of the flight could now sense that something bigger was happening. But no one knew just how big. Ms. Chandler's growing dread. Ms. Chandler took a slow breath, trying to regain her composure. The rules, the structure, the sense of control she had always relied on. It had all been turned against her in a matter of minutes. She had miscalculated. For years, she had believed that her instincts were always right, that she had the authority to decide who belonged where. But now, for the first time in her career, she was the one being judged. And worse, she was waiting for a punishment she had no control over. Sienna, still leaning against the galley entrance, finally spoke again, her voice calm but edged with something else. You should probably sit down before you collapse. Ms. Chandler shot her a glare, but there was no real fire behind it. Instead, she squared her shoulders and forced herself back into work mode, reaching for a tray and straightening the glasses. I have a job to do, she muttered. Sienna gave her a long look, then smirked. For now. Ms. Chandler pretended not to hear that. She had survived difficult passengers. She had handled rude executives, entitled businessmen, demanding travelers. She had made calls before, moved passengers around, enforced order. But this wasn't just a seating issue. This was about who she had judged, and who she had just insulted in front of an entire plane. Her hands shook slightly as she placed a glass back onto a tray, the realization clawing at her. She had just humiliated the one man on this plane who had the power to end her career with a single email. And she had done it publicly. She glanced toward the cockpit, wondering if she should go there herself, try to explain, to defend herself before they landed. But deep down, she knew. There was no explanation that would fix this. Ethan's next move back in first class, Ethan scrolled through his emails, his expression calm but focused. His assistant had already sent a preliminary report, and just as expected, it was being escalated. He knew this airline inside and out, and he knew how to handle situations like this. Ms. Chandler wouldn't be quietly reassigned to another flight. No, this incident would be reviewed at the highest level, and not just for her, for the entire staff. This wasn't about one mistake. It was about how many times things like this happened without consequences. He glanced up briefly, noticing the awkward glances from other passengers. Some of them had seen what happened, some had chosen to ignore it. But now they weren't sure what to do, because they knew who he was. Ethan exhaled slowly, stretching his fingers before tapping out a quick message. Ethan, we're landing in less than an hour. Make sure the ground team is ready. His assistant's reply was immediate. Assistant, they'll be waiting at the gate. Ethan's expression didn't change. He had never been the kind of man to shout, to throw his weight around unnecessarily. But there were times when a quiet lesson carried more weight than a loud one. And this would be one of those times. The rest of the flight crew notices in the galley, the other flight attendants were whispering now. Even those who had been neutral at first were starting to sense the fallout coming. One of them, Jacob, nudged Sienna. What's going on? Sienna crossed her arms. Chandler messed up, badly. Jacob frowned. I mean, yeah, I saw her move that guy, but that guy, Sienna interrupted, is Ethan Vance. Jacob froze. His eyes widened slightly, the full weight of that name sinking in. No way, he muttered. She kicked him out of first class? Sienna smirked slightly, but there was no humor in it. Yep. Jacob rubbed the back of his neck. Damn, she's done, isn't she? Sienna let out a low breath. If she's lucky, she'll just be fired. Jacob's brows lifted. If she's lucky. Sienna glanced toward the first-class cabin, where Ethan sat unbothered, completely in control of the situation. She shook her head. We work in the airline industry, Jacob. What do you think happens when you humiliate the man who owns the sky you're flying in? Jacob let out a low whistle, his gaze flickering toward Ms. Chandler. She was still standing in the galley, pretending to be busy, but everyone could see the truth now. She was sweating. The descent begins. A few minutes later, the seatbelt sign dinged on. The captain's voice came through the intercom, smooth, professional, but carrying an unspoken weight. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are in their upright positions. We'll be landing shortly. Ethan casually buckled his seatbelt, his expression unchanged. But he checked his phone one last time. A new message had come in. Assistant, security has been notified. The executive team will be waiting at the gate. Ms. Chandler is expected to report immediately upon landing. Ethan smirked slightly, slipping his phone back into his pocket. He wasn't a man who enjoyed watching people suffer, but he did believe in accountability. And Ms. Chandler? She had no idea how much trouble was waiting for her just beyond the runway. The descent had begun, but for Ms. Chandler, the real drop was only just starting. She stood near the galley, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, staring blankly at the seatbelt sign above her. She could hear the low murmur of passengers fastening their belts, the rustling of belongings being tucked away, the routine sounds of landing preparations. But all she could focus on was the slow, sinking realization that this flight was not going to end like any other. She had spent years thinking she understood power, that she could command control with a firm voice, a straight posture, and a confident stare. But now, she was beginning to realize that real power didn't need to shout. It didn't need to argue. It just waited. And right now, Ethan Vance was waiting. The final few minutes in the air, Ethan sat comfortably, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest as the plane continued its gradual descent. He had no interest in humiliating Ms. Chandler for the sake of it. He wasn't a cruel man, but this wasn't just about him. He had been in the airline industry long enough to know that this kind of thing happened more often than people like to admit. Passengers got judged, passengers got dismissed, and most of the time, they never got justice. But this time, it was different. He felt the shift in the air, not just from the altitude change, but from the way the entire crew was behaving now. The attendants who had once moved confidently through first class were now stealing glances toward Miss Chandler. Some of them had already distanced themselves from her, as if sensing the inevitable outcome. Sienna, standing near the aisle, exchanged a quick look with Jacob. Neither of them spoke, but they didn't have to. They knew. Ms. Chandler was finished, and Ms. Chandler, she knew it too. Landing approach. The final countdown. The captain's voice came through the intercom, smooth as ever. Cabin crew, prepare for landing. Ms. Chandler's fingers curled into a fist. She forced herself to straighten her shoulders, to calm her breathing, to pretend everything was normal. But everything was not normal. Because in less than 10 minutes she would be stepping off this plane, not as a flight attendant with seniority, but as a woman walking straight into a storm. She had to think. What could she do? Would an apology be enough? Could she explain her way out of this? She had already apologized, and Ethan had already decided. This wasn't just a matter of whether she kept her job. It was a matter of whether she walked away from this flight with her reputation intact. And deep down, she knew the answer to that. Touchdown. The moment everything changed. The wheels hit the runway with a firm jolt, and the plane began its controlled deceleration. The engines hummed louder for a moment before easing into a smooth, steady taxi toward the gate. Passengers exhaled, some stretching, some reaching for their belongings, most unaware that something bigger was unfolding behind the scenes. But Miss Chandler? She felt like she couldn't breathe. Her hands itched to grab the in-flight phone and ask the captain if she was required to report anywhere upon landing. But she already knew what the answer would be. It was out of her hands now. She took one last, slow breath and adjusted her uniform, trying to hold on to whatever authority she had left. But when she looked up, she met Sienna's gaze. The younger flight attendant didn't say anything. She just watched, and somehow that was worse. The final announcement. The intercom crackled one last time. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of our crew, thank you for flying with us today. Ethan didn't move right away. He could feel the tension coming from the galley, from the staff, from the few passengers who had put the pieces together. He wasn't angry. He wasn't smug. He was just waiting. For Miss Chandler, the hardest part of this flight hadn't even begun yet. She just didn't know how bad it was going to get, because as the plane finally rolled toward the gate, 2 uniformed men in dark suits were already waiting just beyond the glass. Security. And standing behind them, a senior airline executive. Their arms were crossed, their expressions unreadable, and they were waiting for her. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers stood, stretching, reaching for their bags. The usual shuffle of disembarkation had begun. But for Miss Chandler, there was nothing usual about this moment. This wasn't just another landing. This was the end of something, and she could feel it. The seatbelt sign had barely turned off, but Miss Chandler couldn't move. She sat frozen in the galley, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter as the first-class passengers stood, stretching their legs, grabbing their bags. They acted as if this was just another flight. But for her, it was anything but. Her eyes flickered to the cabin door where security and a senior airline executive stood just beyond the glass. They weren't here for a random passenger disturbance. They weren't here for an airport issue. They were here for her. Her stomach twisted. She had always been the one with authority, the one with control, the one making the rules and enforcing them. But now, she was the one being summoned. She glanced toward Ethan's seat. He hadn't even stood up yet. While the rest of the passengers grabbed their carry-ons, stretching and making polite small talk, he remained calm, still, composed, and waiting. She knew why. Because Ethan Vance didn't need to rush. He knew what was coming. The walk of shame. Ms. Chandler inhaled sharply, forcing herself to stand straight, adjust her uniform, and step forward. She had always believed in handling things with professionalism. But now she wasn't sure if professionalism would even matter. She took a deep breath and stepped into the aisle. And as soon as she did, she felt the shift. Passengers who had once ignored her now stole quick glances as she walked past. Some had watched what happened earlier, piecing together that something was wrong. Others simply followed the tension in the air. Ms. Chandler walked past economy, past the very seat where she had forced Ethan to sit only hours ago. Now she was the one being forced into something, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Ethan's exit. As Ms. Chandler approached the cabin door, Ethan finally stood. He stretched, slow and deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. And then, with the same calm energy he had maintained throughout the flight, he stepped into the aisle. Passengers nearby stiffened, as if realizing just how much had shifted since takeoff. Ms. Chandler reached the exit first, standing just a few feet from the airline executive and security. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat. The executive didn't speak immediately. Neither did security. They were waiting. Waiting for Ethan to disembark first. That was when Ms. Chandler fully understood. This wasn't just about removing a passenger from first class. This was about removing the wrong one. She heard Ethan's footsteps behind her as he approached the exit, the presence of power without even trying. And then, for the first time since she had been forced to bring him back to first class, he finally spoke to her. His voice was calm, level, and quiet enough that only she could hear. Next time, check the ticket before you check the person. It was not cruel, not mocking, just the truth. A truth she should have already known. Ethan stepped past her, through the door, greeted by the airline executive with a handshake and a nod of respect. A nod that she would never receive again. Ms. Chandler stared straight ahead, feeling the walls of her career closing in. The consequences await. The airline executive finally spoke. "Ms. Chandler," he said, his voice formal, clipped, carrying the weight of something final. "Come with us." She didn't argue. She didn't try to defend herself. There was nothing left to say. Because for the first time in her life she understood. She was no longer the one in charge. And she never would be again. Ms. Chandler's legs felt unsteady as she stepped onto the jet bridge, each step heavier than the last. The noise of the airport, distant announcements, rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, felt muted, almost unreal. She had walked through these corridors hundreds of times, always with authority, with purpose, with confidence. But now she wasn't walking as a leader. She was walking as the accused. The airline executive, a tall man in a sharp gray suit with a face like stone, walked ahead without looking at her once. Security followed behind her, silent but present, making it clear that this was not optional. She swallowed the lump in her throat, keeping her posture straight, trying to hold on to some piece of dignity, trying to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could still fix this. Ethan's private arrival. Meanwhile, just a few feet away, Ethan Vance exited the aircraft into an entirely different world. A sleek black car with tinted windows was already waiting just outside the private terminal entrance. His assistant, Lucas Hayes, stood beside it, his tablet in one hand and his phone in the other. Lucas barely looked up as Ethan approached, already multitasking between emails and messages. "The board is aware," Lucas said smoothly, stepping aside as Ethan slid into the back seat of the car. "They want to handle this internally before anything goes public." Ethan leaned back against the seat, unbothered, adjusting his watch. "And Chandler?" he asked, his voice calm, even. Lucas finally looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Being escorted to a private meeting room as we speak." Ethan smirked slightly. "I hope she enjoys her last meeting as an airline employee," he murmured. Lucas hesitated. "Are you sure about this? I mean, a full termination? Wouldn't a suspension be enough?" Ethan's eyes flickered toward Lucas, his usual calm gaze sharpening just slightly. Lucas exhaled, already knowing the answer. "This isn't about her," Ethan said, his voice cool, measured. "This is about all the people like her who have done the same thing and never got caught." Lucas nodded once. He had seen this before. Ethan wasn't interested in petty revenge. He was interested in change. And Ms. Chandler? She had just become the example. The meeting room. Final judgment. Ms. Chandler was led down a quiet hallway, past the usual airport offices and into a small, soundproof conference room. A long table stretched across the center, papers neatly stacked, a single chair pulled out, waiting for her. She hesitated, standing in the doorway, her breath shallow. Inside the room, 3 senior airline officials sat on the opposite side of the table. They were not flight supervisors. They were not managers. These were executives. The people who decided who stayed and who was removed. The people who decided her future. She swallowed hard and stepped inside. The moment she did, the door clicked shut behind her. One of the executives, an older woman with steel gray hair and an unreadable expression, folded her hands on the table and spoke. "Ms. Chandler," she said, her voice as calm as it was final. "Have a seat." Ms. Chandler slowly sat down, her back straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. No one spoke for a moment. Then the gray-haired executive spoke again. "Do you understand why you're here?" Ms. Chandler's mouth felt dry. She knew that whatever she said next would determine the rest of her career. She licked her lips, forcing her voice to remain steady. There was a... She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. There was a seating issue on the flight. The second executive, a tall man with a firm jaw and sharp eyes, raised an eyebrow. "A seating issue?" Ms. Chandler forced herself not to flinch. "Yes," she continued. "A misunderstanding about a passenger's status in first class." The third executive, a bald man who had been reading over the official report, finally looked up. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated. "Ms. Chandler, is that what you're calling it?" The room fell into silence. And suddenly, she knew. They weren't here to hear her side of the story. They already had the facts. The reports had been filed. The statements had been gathered. Her actions had been reviewed. And now they were simply here to deliver the verdict. She wasn't getting out of this. The official decision. The gray-haired executive finally slid a piece of paper toward her. Her voice was as steady as a judge passing sentence. "Effective immediately, you are relieved of your position as senior flight attendant," she said. Ms. Chandler felt her stomach drop. "Your employment with this airline has been terminated." Her breath hitched, her fingers tightening against the edge of the table. The second executive held up a hand. "This decision is final," he said. "Your conduct on Flight 417 was unacceptable. You did not verify a first-class passenger's ticket. You acted based on assumption, and you publicly humiliated someone who had every right to be in the seat you forced him out of." The third executive leaned forward, his gaze unyielding. "And Ms. Chandler?" he said, his voice lower, colder. "The passenger you humiliated was Ethan Vance." The weight of those words crushed any last hope she had. She had spent years making snap judgments, years deciding who belonged and who didn't. And now, for the first time, she was the one being judged. And she had been found unworthy. The end of an era. Ms. Chandler stared at the termination letter, her eyes burning. 10 years. 10 years of flying. 10 years of experience. Gone. Because of one choice. One wrong choice. Her mind raced, grasping for a way out, for something she could say, for a chance to salvage what was left. But there was nothing. No second chances. No negotiation. Just the cold, brutal weight of accountability. The gray-haired executive stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Security will escort you out. And just like that, it was over. Ms. Chandler slowly rose from her chair, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the termination letter. As she turned to leave, the third executive spoke one last time. "Maybe next time," he said. "Before you judge someone by their appearance, you'll think twice." Ms. Chandler didn't reply. She walked to the door, her vision blurred, her body feeling heavier than it ever had. Security opened the door for her, and as she stepped into the hallway, the reality of what had just happened finally hit her. She had entered the room as a senior flight attendant, and now she was just another person walking out of an airport, with nowhere to go. Ms. Chandler stepped out of the conference room, her termination letter still clenched in her trembling hands. The weight of the paper felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried every mistake she had made on that flight. Security walked a step behind her, but they didn't have to drag her out. She wasn't resisting. What would be the point? The walk through the long, sterile hallway of the airline's administrative offices felt surreal. Just hours ago, she had been the one giving orders, the one standing firm, the one who controlled situations with her authority. Now, she was being escorted out of the very company she had dedicated a decade of her life to. Every step she took felt heavier, like she was walking through quicksand. It wasn't just a job she had lost. It was her identity. A career gone in seconds. She had been good at this job, or at least she had believed she was. She had been strict, yes. She had been firm, yes. But in her mind, that had been part of the job. Keeping passengers in check, maintaining order, making judgment calls. She had never second-guessed herself, until today. Because now, she was finally being forced to look at the way she had handled things. And what she saw. It wasn't pretty. Her mind kept playing the moment back, the way she had questioned Ethan Vance before even looking at his ticket. The confidence in her voice as she dismissed him. The satisfaction she had felt sending him to economy. She had been so sure she was right, and that certainty had destroyed her. Security led her through a side exit, away from the main passenger terminals. No public firing, no dramatic scene, just quiet, deliberate consequences. But that almost made it worse, because this was the kind of punishment that didn't fade with time. This was the kind of punishment that would follow her. A reputation ruined. She pushed open the exit door and stepped into the warm afternoon air. For the first time in 10 years, she was outside the airport without a uniform, without a title, without a purpose. She wasn't staff anymore. She wasn't part of this world. She was just another former employee walking toward an uncertain future. A part of her wanted to scream, to argue, to defend herself, but what was left to defend? The entire airline knew what she had done. Her name was probably already being circulated through aviation circles. A cautionary tale of what happens when you judge the wrong person. Would she ever get hired by another airline? She doubted it. Her reputation was ruined. She had spent years making snap decisions about passengers, and now the industry had made a snap decision about her. Ethan's quiet departure. A few yards away, a black luxury car sat parked near the private exit. Inside, Ethan Vance watched as Ms. Chandler stepped out, standing still in the open air like she didn't know where to go. She hadn't seen him yet. Lucas, his assistant, checked his phone, then looked up. "She's out." Ethan didn't respond right away. He just watched her, his face unreadable. "She looks lost," Lucas added after a moment. Ethan finally exhaled through his nose. "She should be." Lucas hesitated before asking, "Do you think she'll learn anything from this?" Ethan leaned his head back against the seat, staring at the roof of the car. "I don't know. he admitted. Some people do, some people don't. Lucas nodded. Do you think she deserved to be fired? Ethan thought about it. He wasn't a vengeful man. He wasn't someone who enjoyed watching people lose everything. But this had never been about revenge. It had been about accountability. I think she deserved to know what it feels like to be dismissed without a second thought, he said finally. To be treated like an inconvenience, like she doesn't belong. Because that's exactly what she did to me. Lucas didn't argue. They both knew this wasn't just about one flight attendant. It was about the way people in power misused that power. And today, for once, the consequences had landed on the right person. Ms. Chandler's last moment of denial. Ms. Chandler finally moved. She pulled out her phone, fingers trembling, and scrolled through her contacts. She needed to call someone, a friend, a former colleague, someone who could help. She needed to find a way back into the industry. Because if she didn't, she had nowhere else to go. She had built her life around this job. And now? Now she had nothing. She clicked on a contact, a former manager she had worked with years ago. She pressed call. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Voicemail. She swallowed, then tried another contact. Voicemail. Another. Voicemail. Her stomach tightened with something cold and sharp. They knew, they all knew. No one was going to help her. No one wanted to be associated with her name now. The realization hit her like a gut punch. She had spent years making decisions about people. And now, the industry had made a decision about her. The final shift. She slowly lowered the phone, staring at nothing. Her body felt numb, because for the first time since this whole thing had started, for the first time since she had told Ethan Vance to move to economy without even checking his ticket, she finally understood. She finally saw herself the way others had seen her. Not as a leader, not as a professional, but as someone who had let power get to her head. And now, she had none left. She had misjudged the wrong person. And the price. Everything. Ethan's final words. Ethan watched her from the car, his expression still unreadable. Lucas was silent beside him. Ethan finally spoke, but not to anyone in particular. Maybe next time she'll think twice. He closed his eyes, exhaling slowly as the car pulled away from the curb. Because this time, for once, the lesson hadn't been for him. It had been for her. Ms. Chandler stood on the sidewalk outside the airport's private exit, her phone still clutched in her trembling hand. The screen had gone dark, but she couldn't bring herself to put it away. She had called everyone she could think of. No one had answered. Not a single one. Her stomach twisted. The industry had turned its back on her before she even had a chance to explain herself. She had spent her career thinking she was untouchable. Senior flight attendants didn't just get fired. They got reassigned, transferred, given another chance. But this wasn't a mistake that could be fixed with a quiet meeting and a slap on the wrist. Because this hadn't just been a simple seating issue. It had been a public humiliation, a decision made on bias rather than fact. And it had happened to the one person who could ensure she never worked in the airline industry again. Her breath came faster now, panic creeping in. What was she supposed to do now? She had worked for 10 years to build this career. She had put in long hours, taken overnight shifts, handled difficult passengers. She had earned her place at the top, or at least she had thought she had. But in the end, it had taken less than a minute to erase everything. The weight of her actions. Her eyes followed the sleek black car as it disappeared from view. Ethan was gone now. He had walked off the plane with his reputation intact, his authority unquestioned, and his career unchanged. And she had walked off with nothing. She knew he hadn't done this to be cruel. That was the worst part. He hadn't yelled at her, he hadn't demanded she be fired. He hadn't even been angry. He had just let her dig her own grave. Because the moment she refused to check his ticket, the moment she decided he wasn't worthy of first class based on nothing but an assumption, she had sealed her own fate. She had done this to herself. And now, She was facing a truth she had never wanted to confront. How many others had she treated the same way? How many times had she dismissed someone based on appearance? How many people had been forced into economy, into discomfort, into humiliation, without any way to fight back? Because the difference between them and Ethan Vance? They hadn't owned the airline. They had just taken their mistreatment quietly. And now, she was the one forced to sit in the discomfort of her own decisions. Nowhere to go. A gust of wind blew against her, but she barely noticed. Her mind was spinning. What now? She couldn't just walk back into the airport and pretend nothing had happened. She couldn't just apply to another airline and hope they wouldn't hear about this. Because they already had. The airline industry was a small world, and news traveled fast. Even if this incident never made the headlines, the right people already knew. Every application she sent would hit a dead end. Every recommendation letter would be ignored. Her name? It was already stained. And the worst part? She had no backup plan. This job had been her entire life. She had never needed to think about what she would do if it disappeared. And now she had to figure it out alone. A new reality. A couple of airport employees passed her, chatting casually, heading toward the staff entrance. She had walked through that door so many times before. But now she was locked out of the very world she had controlled for years. Her authority was gone. Her status was gone. Her certainty was gone. She wanted to convince herself that this was unfair, that she had been treated too harshly, that she deserved another chance. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had built her career on making judgment calls, and today, judgment had finally been passed on her. She turned, walking away from the airport, not because she wanted to, but because she had nowhere else to go. And for the first time in her life, she was the one being left behind. Miss Chandler's footsteps felt heavier with every step she took away from the airport. The smooth, polished floors of the terminal were now behind her, replaced by the rough, uneven pavement leading toward the distant parking lot. The world she had once ruled over, the flights, the attendants, the passengers, the unchallenged authority she had carried for years, was no longer hers. And for the first time in a decade, she had nowhere to go. The weight of finality. She had always thought of the airport as her second home. She had memorized every corner of it, from the break rooms where she sipped coffee before early morning flights to the customer service counters, where she had watched travelers fumble with their documents. She had known the airline codes by heart, the emergency protocols like second nature, and the best ways to handle passengers, or so she had thought. But none of that mattered now. She had walked these halls with power. Now, she was just another person leaving, stripped of everything that had once made her important. The security officer stood near the employee exit, watching her as she walked by. He had seen her countless times before, rushing to flights, giving orders, demanding efficiency. Now she was just another face, another fired employee, another mistake walking out of the airport. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. Her chest tightened as she passed through the automatic doors, stepping into the late afternoon heat. For a brief, desperate moment, she almost turned back, almost walked back inside, almost tried to explain herself one more time. But there was no one left to listen. The last attempt at control. She pulled her phone from her pocket again, her fingers unsteady. Her contacts list blurred before her eyes as she scrolled down, her mind grasping for someone, anyone, who could help. Maybe she could talk to an old supervisor. Maybe she could find a way to get reinstated. Maybe she could fix this. But as she clicked on name after name, one thing became painfully clear. Nobody was answering. Voicemail after voicemail, unread messages, silence. Her fingers tightened around the phone. She had spent years enforcing order, making decisions, controlling people's fates. And now she was powerless. She had spent her career deciding who belonged and who didn't. And now, she was the one who didn't belong anywhere. She exhaled sharply, blinking hard, forcing herself to keep walking. She wouldn't break. She refused to. She had been a flight attendant for a decade, She had seen grown men sob over missed flights, families break down over lost luggage, angry passengers reduced to nothing when their demands weren't met. She had watched people lose their tempers, their patience, their dignity. But now, it was her turn to be on the receiving end of a reality she had once enforced. And it felt different when it was happening to her. Ethan's final decision. Meanwhile, not far away, Ethan Vance sat in the back of his car, watching the airport grow smaller in the distance. Lucas sat beside him, his laptop open as he went over the final report from the airline's executive team. "Her termination is official," Lucas said after a moment, tapping at the keyboard. "They're marking it as a policy violation, but no public statement will be made." Ethan gave a slow nod, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. He wasn't surprised. Big corporations rarely like to admit when something went wrong. They would handle it quietly. Ms. Chandler would be removed from their records, erased from the employee database, and the whole incident would be buried. It was the airline industry's way of moving on without consequences. But this time, there had been consequences. Ethan turned to Lucas. "Any sign that she's trying to fight it?" Lucas shook his head. "She's been calling people, but no one's responding. Her connections are distancing themselves already." Ethan wasn't surprised. In this world, reputation meant everything. And Ms. Chandler's? It was already ruined. Lucas hesitated, glancing at his boss. "Do you ever feel bad about things like this?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He stared out the window, watching the sun begin to dip toward the horizon. "I don't like watching people lose their livelihoods," he admitted. Lucas raised an eyebrow. "But?" Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "But I don't like watching people get away with treating others like they're nothing, either." Lucas nodded slowly. Ethan continued. "How many passengers have been treated the same way she treated me, without anyone stepping in?" Lucas didn't need to answer. They both knew the truth. Ethan had been lucky. He had power. He had a voice. But the countless others who had been forced out of first class, dismissed, judged unfairly, they had no voice. No one had fought for them. And that was why this mattered. This wasn't just about Ms. Chandler losing her job. This was about sending a message, one that said, if you think you can treat people unfairly and walk away without consequences, think again. Ethan leaned back in his seat, letting out a quiet breath. Lucas glanced at him. "So, that's it?" Ethan gave a slight nod. "That's it." Ms. Chandler's final realization. Ms. Chandler reached the far end of the parking lot, her legs aching, her mind spinning. She stopped beside the bus stop, staring at the empty street ahead. For the first time since she had stepped onto that plane, she was forced to sit with herself, without her uniform, without her title, without her power, and without an excuse. She had been fired. She had been abandoned by her colleagues. She had lost everything. And for the first time, she couldn't blame anyone but herself, because it hadn't been the airline that had done this to her. It hadn't been Ethan Vance. It had been her own choices. She sat down on the metal bench, her hands gripping the edge, her thoughts racing. She had once thought that power meant never being questioned, but now she finally understood. Real power wasn't about control. It wasn't about putting people in their place. It was about respect. And she had spent her entire career withholding that from the very people she was meant to serve. Now, she was the one left behind, alone, forgotten. And for the first time in her life, she truly understood what that felt like. As the sun began to set over the airport, Ms. Chandler sat in complete silence, staring at the darkening sky, with nothing left but the weight of her own mistakes. And this time, there was no one coming to save her. What do you think about this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss more stories like this.